Dust-choked air lingered over Greenwood Valley, a ramshackle frontier town, clinging to the edge of civilization, when Charlotte Addison arrived, trembling, hopeful, and entirely unprepared. She'd come all the way from Boston as a mail-order bride, promising herself a better life in the West, only to discover the settlement half-buried by a catastrophic mudslide. Amid the devastation, townsfolk with desperate tempers ran hot, and hope felt as elusive as water in the desert. Enter Daniel McGraw, a former Texas Ranger, scarred by tragedy, yet unwilling to see an innocent woman swallowed by ruin. Together they'd stand against the odds, forging a bond stronger than the raging storm that nearly tore them apart. In the late summer of 1882, a sense of restless anticipation settled across the vast Texan frontier. At dusk, golden sunlight kissed the crests of rolling hills, and purple shadows cooled the valleys. Mustangs roamed the plains, while far-off ranch hands drove cattle to railheads in newly established towns. Work was punishing, days were blisteringly hot, and survival often hinged on a single stroke of luck or the kindness of strangers. Greenwood Valley was neither the largest nor the most prosperous settlement. It was tucked between rocky hills, near the edge of the Texas-New Mexico border, where wagon trails snaked through mesquite trees. The town grew around a small silver strike some years back, attracting prospectors, dreamers, and desperados in equal measure. By 1882, the silver veins had run thin. Many folks had moved on, except for a steadfast handful who'd built homes, saloons, and stables on the land. They believed the real fortune lay not in silver, but in the determination to carve a life out of the dust. Gossip traveled fast in the territory, on par with the swirling winds. Since early spring, townsfolk buzzed about an Eastern woman rumored to be arriving soon. The hush-hush talk was that she had accepted a mail-order marriage proposal from the local blacksmith Zachary Turner, a man in dire need of companionship and a partner to help raise his two young nephews. Folks had all sorts of opinions. Some admired the woman's bravery in uprooting her life. Others were convinced it was naive for any decent lady to place her trust in a man she'd never met, hundreds of miles away from her only known world. The dusty roads to Greenwood Valley were unforgiving. For those who dared to cross the desert on stagecoaches or wagons, the hazards were many rattlesnakes, sudden storms, broken axles, or roving bands of outlaws. One day's travel might be scorching hot, while the next day's route could flood or turn into sticky mud under a surprise downpour. The railroad line, still under construction, ended some miles east of Greenwood. The last leg of any traveler's journey demanded grit, determination, and no small amount of prayer. It was under these precarious circumstances that Charlotte Addison made her way west. Though many in Greenwood had grown skeptical of outsiders' claims, they soon discovered that she came with tangible references. A letter from a certain Reverend Jonathan Blake of Boston testified to her good character, describing her as devout, patient, and skilled in homemaking qualifications that delighted practical frontier men. Despite the admirable letter, rumors persisted. "It's a strange business one," saloon patrons said, swirling whiskey in his glass. "But out here we take what help we can get. If she's half as good as they say, it'll be a blessing." Beyond talk of silver and brides, the frontier also braced for a turn in the weather. Throughout late July, storms had battered the hillside. A prominent rancher named Jesse Middleton wrote to his friend, the retired Ranger Captain Bill McDonald, about how the land looked battered. Real Texan storms had a way of reshaping not just the topography, but the destinies of those who called the land home. And unbeknownst to Charlotte Addison, she was on a collision course with one of the most brutal mudslides the territory had ever seen. As she inched closer to Greenwood, the unspoken question in every heart was simple. Would this refined, well-bred lady from Boston find her footing in a scrappy frontier town? Or would the land devour her ambition and spit her out onto the next eastbound stage? The gloom of the gathering storms cast long shadows on the town. One thing was certain: this land harbored secrets as ancient as the canyon walls. And each new arrival, perhaps Charlotte most of all, would have to earn its respect or face its wrath. Charlotte Addison's final morning in Boston was a swirl of apprehensive excitement. Dressed in a modest but tastefully cut traveling suit of navy blue serge, she bid farewell to her boarding house matron, Mrs. Lillian Spencer, whose watery eyes betrayed her concern. "I pray you'll find happiness, my dear," Mrs. Spencer sniffed, hugging Charlotte. "It's a dangerous place, that frontier full of rough men and wild weather." Charlotte, with a polite smile, assured her that she felt called to make this brave leap not out of desperation, but from a longing to be part of something larger than the stifling constraints of her hometown. The mail-order arrangement had roots in a chance conversation with Reverend Jonathan Blake. Charlotte had grown weary of teaching at a small school. Day after day, she spent her meager wages on rent and daily bread, with no family left to offer her a future. Reverend Blake, who had once traveled west to do mission work, mentioned he received letters from men in frontier towns searching for wives. One letter from a certain Zachary Turner stood out for its sincerity. He admitted no illusions. He was no wealthy rancher, just a hard-working blacksmith raising 2 orphaned nephews. If a decent woman wanted a home, if she desired to be needed, he could provide that. With the Reverend's blessings and a fierce determination in her heart, Charlotte wrote back to Zachary. Over the months of exchanged letters, she discovered a man who was earnest, faithful, and deeply devoted to his nephews, Patrick and Graham. Zachary's mother had passed years before, and he claimed to have no one else in Greenwood to help care for the 2 young boys. A sense of both longing and compassion stirred in Charlotte's breast. Soon, a proposal formed in carefully penned words. When Charlotte said yes, she felt relief flooding her heart. Perhaps this was Providence handing her a destiny of her own making. The journey west was as grueling as rumor promised. After taking the train from Boston down to St. Louis, Charlotte boarded a smaller railway westward until the line ended in a dusty, half-constructed station near the Texas border. Here, she switched to a stagecoach that pitched and lurched for endless hours. By the time they rattled onto a lonely route toward Greenwood, she could hardly sleep, her back stiff from days of jostling. The rest stops were few, the coffee bitter, and the other passengers, 2 traveling salesmen and a taciturn drifter, kept mostly to themselves. One day, the stage driver, a surly man named Tobias Gray, mentioned ominous news: "We're getting big storms up in the hills around Greenwood. Roads get slick. If the heavens decide to open up again, we may see slides." Charlotte, pressing her face to the window, saw angry storm clouds gathering in the distance. Thunder rumbled like a hungry beast. Even so, her confidence surged. She was resolute. No matter how the weather turned, her future lay at the end of this route. On the 4th day out of the small railroad station, the stage reached a fork in the trail. To the left loomed a steep pass that would cut hours from the journey. To the right, a longer road that wound safely around the hills. Tobias Gray hesitated, glancing at the darkening sky. Determined to keep on schedule, he took the pass. Rain soon began to pound, turning the dusty track into churned mud. The wheels threatened to sink at every jolt. Charlotte clung to her seat, praying quietly. The thunder became deafening. Lightning streaked the sky, and soon a torrential downpour slicked the rocky slopes. While the stage pressed through mud and rivulets of water, Charlotte witnessed the raw power of a Texan storm for the first time. Large rocks clattered down from the hills. One crashed dangerously close to the coach, sending Tobias Gray cursing. Finally, after a tense stretch of hours, they descended into a clearing where the slopes parted slightly, revealing the outskirts of Greenwood Valley. The sight she beheld was a battered town under low, menacing clouds. Broken fences and debris suggested the storm's fury had already visited here. Yet the fires in the lamplit windows glowed defiantly, proof of the people's resilience. Charlotte's eyes brimmed with tears, partly of exhaustion and partly in awe of a community braving such elements daily. As she alighted from the coach, she clutched her single suitcase, stepping tentatively onto the muddy street that formed Greenwood's main thoroughfare. Zachary Turner was nowhere in sight. Instead, a cluster of worried onlookers hurried toward the stage, each searching for cargo or news. "Where's the blacksmith?" Charlotte whispered to herself, scanning anxious faces. Soon, she would learn the devastating truth. The mudslides had come with merciless force, just a day before trapping or even burying parts of the settlement. The introduction to her new home would not be a gentle one. And at that moment, Charlotte Addison stood in the rain, the swirl of fear and hope threatening to consume her. She had arrived. But had it all been for nothing, the storm finally abated, leaving a suffocating humidity in its wake. The stage pulled away, eager to continue its route before the road worsened. Charlotte found herself standing on the wooden porch outside the Greenwood General Mercantile, its fading sign squeaking on rusty chains. A small crowd gathered: shopkeepers, ranch hands, and a few curious children. They stared at Charlotte, half in pity and half in intrigue. After all, how often did a mail-order bride appear? In their rain-lashed midst, Ma'am greeted a middle-aged woman dressed in a calico skirt. She had kind eyes and wore an apron over her frock, her hair pinned under a checkered bonnet. "Name's Rebecca Lowry. I run the mercantile here." "You must be Charlotte Addison," Charlotte replied, her voice trembling with relief at hearing someone speak to her with warmth. "I'm supposed to meet Zachary Turner. Do you happen to know?" Rebecca's face clouded with concern, and she gently laid a hand on Charlotte's arm. "We've had a real bad mudslide. Came crashing down from the hills after yesterday's storm. Half of the Turner homestead's been swept away. Zachary's alive, last I heard. He and some men are digging through debris. They're trying to find the two nephews, Patrick and Graham. Nobody's seen them since morning." The words struck Charlotte like a hammer blow. She had imagined this moment so differently: a quiet introduction, polite conversation over a home-cooked meal, the timid smiles of children she hoped to call family. Now only devastation loomed. Her mind spun with dread. "I need to get there," she said, her voice unsteady. "I must help." Rebecca nodded, summoning a teenage boy from the crowd. "Matthew, show Miss Addison to the blacksmith's place, and fetch help if you need it, but watch for falling rocks. The ground's still unstable." The boy agreed, and Charlotte followed him through muddy ruts that passed between the saloon, a half-collapsed livery stable, and a boarded-up building that once served as a silver assay office. As they trudged, Charlotte noticed how quiet the town was, not the cheerful bustle she'd expected, but a low hum of dread. Families huddled under overhangs, trying to salvage what they could from the floodwaters. Soon, they came to a series of modest wooden structures on the town's edge. One large building, partially canted at a precarious angle, displayed the sign, "Turner and Sons Blacksmith." Outside, men hacked away at a massive drift of mudstones and torn lumber. The stench of soggy earth hung in the air. Charlotte recognized Zachary Turner from the daguerreotype he had sent, tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy hair and earnest eyes. He was caked in mud, his face lined with equal parts exhaustion and desperation. Zachary, Charlotte called, gently stepping forward. The blacksmith paused, turning. His eyes, ravaged by worry, flitted over her travel-worn appearance. Charlotte Addison, he half whispered, half gasped. For a moment, there was a flicker of regret in his gaze, as though he wished she hadn't come at such a grim time, bearing witness to his despair. But he swallowed it, and in a moment of raw honesty said, "I'm sorry you have to see this. We can't find Patrick and Graham. They're trapped or worse." His eyes brimmed with tears he refused to let fall. Charlotte's heart hammered. Without hesitation, she dropped her suitcase in the mud and rolled up her sleeves. She was no stranger to adversity. Her father's passing had once left her family destitute, forcing her to fend for herself. She recalled that struggle now, using it to steel herself. "Tell me what I can do," she said. In the next moments, Charlotte found herself shoulder to shoulder with Zachary, digging through muck and twisted boards. Her arms burned, and her dress was soon ruined. But none of that mattered. She felt oddly calm, driven by a singular determination to help. Daylight waned, but eventually a shout went up from the other side of the property. "Here, we found them." Men hauled away beams, revealing the small forms of Patrick and Graham. The boys were muddy, bruised, and terrified, but alive. A rush of relief cascaded through the group as the unconscious children were carried into a nearby stable. Charlotte cradled them, tears streaming down her face. Zachary collapsed to his knees in the mud, sobbing openly in gratitude. The entire scene felt surreal. Just hours ago, Charlotte had been rattling in a stagecoach, unsure if she'd even find the man to whom she'd promised herself. Now, she was embroiled in a crisis that left no room for formal introductions or coy courtesy. In the dusty lamplight, as night fell over Greenwood Valley, Charlotte finally came face to face with Zachary. Thank you was all he managed. Their combined relief was palpable, even as fear lingered for what tomorrow might bring. Together, they led the boys inside to tend to their cuts and bruises. The first day in her new home had thrust Charlotte into a test of survival and compassion. And while exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, she was certain of one thing: she was not here by accident. Night brought precious little peace. Though the townspeople hoped the storm had passed, the wind picked up around midnight, rattling shutters and moaning through the eaves. Lightning flickered ominously, illuminating the battered settlement in ghostly flashes. Inside the Turner workshop now, a makeshift shelter, Charlotte sat on a stool, watching over Patrick and Graham, who slept fitfully. Their small faces were smudged with grime, but a few spoonfuls of warm broth had calmed their tremors. Both had bruised ribs and scrapes, but no broken bones. Outside, Zachary Turner paced restlessly. The day's frantic rescue mission had left him with a bandaged arm and raw knuckles, but he couldn't sleep. Every time thunder rumbled, he flinched. The memory of losing half his livelihood to the mudslide roiled in his mind. The water trough overturned, the forge damaged, the anvil half buried in debris. His heart clenched at the thought of the boys nearly being taken by the same force. He felt powerless, and seeing Charlotte, a woman he had only known through letters, risk her safety to aid him made his guilt sharper. He had promised her security, a home, a chance to start anew. Instead, she stepped into a nightmare. He turned to find Charlotte watching him from the doorway. A lantern cast dancing shadows on her face, accentuating her soft features etched with concern. "You should rest," she whispered. "All of us should." "I can't," Zachary admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that mud burying the shop." Charlotte moved closer, gently touching his uninjured shoulder. "I might not know the hardships of frontier life, but I do know that we can't keep watch all night and work ourselves beyond reason. We can only do our best and trust tomorrow will be kinder." Zachary's weary gaze flicked to her. "You're a strong woman, Charlotte. We've never met until today, but you saved Patrick and Graham. If you hadn't arrived to help, I might have—" He swallowed hard, unable to finish. An embarrassed flush colored his cheeks. "I'm sorry. This is no fit welcome for you." Before Charlotte could respond, a crack of thunder boomed overhead, rattling the wooden walls. Rain pelted the roof in a fresh assault. They exchanged fearful looks. The ground was already unstable. Another deluge could trigger a second slide. Throwing on coats and hats, they rushed outside into the pelting rain. Through the darkness, they could hear shouting near the edge of town. Lanterns bobbed in the distance. Charlotte's skirts clung to her legs as she darted across the soggy ground. With each flash of lightning, she glimpsed the swollen creek tumbling over its banks, carrying debris in its current. A rider on horseback galloped toward them, splashing muddy water. The rider was a woman wearing a drenched cloak. "Zachary, Charlotte," she yelled, pulling the reins sharply. It was Rebecca Lowry from the Mercantile. Her face dripped with rain, eyes wide with urgency. "A section of the hillside above Greenwood is about to give. We need able-bodied folks to help bolster the levee by the creek. If we can redirect the flow, maybe we can spare the rest of the town from flooding." In that moment, Charlotte realized that these people, her new neighbors, were bound together by an unspoken creed: face the storm or perish. There was no time for hesitation or fear. Zachary grabbed a shovel from the wreckage near the workshop. Charlotte seized a bucket, though she could barely keep her balance in the slick mud. They followed Rebecca to the creek, where a line of townsfolk battled the rising waters. Some piled sandbags, while others heaped rocks and branches to form a makeshift barrier. Shouting instructions mixed with the roar of the storm. Lightning slashed the sky, illuminating worried faces and exhausted limbs. The levee threatened to give way at any second. Charlotte dug in passing buckets of mud and water, helping pack the precarious wall. She felt her arms burn from the effort, her ankles threatening to twist in the uneven terrain. The rain battered her face, plastering her hair to her scalp. She tasted earth and rainwater. Yet she pressed on, fueled by a raw determination that overshadowed her fear. It was in this crucible of chaos that she realized the West demanded everything of a person: their strength, their faith, and their willingness to rely on neighbors for survival. Each scoop of muck felt like a vow she made to herself: "I will not run. I will not yield." At last, after hours of relentless labor, the worst of the rain ceased. Dawn broke through leaden clouds, revealing a battered but still standing Greenwood Valley. The creek's waters receded, leaving the newly reinforced levee marred but unbroken. Townspeople cheered wearily, hugging one another. Zachary dropped to a knee in the mud, panting in relief. Charlotte sank beside him, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. Their eyes met, sharing an unspoken bond formed through adversity. Greenwood was still theirs, battered but not beaten. And in that grey morning light, Charlotte knew she had chosen wisely. This was where she was meant to be, heartbreak and all. Little did she know, even more treacherous trials loomed on the horizon, whispering that life in Greenwood was not done, testing her or its newest ally, a former Texas Ranger she'd yet to properly meet. With the rains mercifully halted for the moment, Greenwood Valley limped through the following day. Families ventured out to assess damage. Children climbed through rubble in search of lost toys. Men hammered planks over broken windows, and women stoked fires for communal meals. The entire town had lost something to the storm: property, livestock, or in some tragic instances, loved ones. Yet what surprised Charlotte was the collective spirit forging ahead. People who'd barely spoken to each other before now offered helping hands. Even the usually crotchety saloon owner Harlan Briggs invited survivors to sleep on his establishment's floor if they needed shelter. Zachary, determined not to abandon his blacksmith trade, joined other able-bodied men in clearing the remains of the forge. They unearthed the anvil from a mountain of debris and managed to salvage some tools. Meanwhile, Charlotte set up a temporary cooking station in what was once an alleyway between the blacksmith shop and a storage shed. She used scraps of metal to fashion a makeshift grill, determined to feed the volunteers. The smell of sizzling bacon soon drew hungry workers who paused gratefully for a warm meal. Zachary's nephews Patrick and Graham were bruised but recovering, clinging to Charlotte's skirts whenever they could. She soothed them with gentle words, a sign that despite everything, she was quickly becoming the nurturing presence Zachary had prayed for. Each time Zachary caught sight of her, comforting the boys, his shoulders slumped with a mixture of relief and a pang of guilt. He'd brought her to Greenwood to be a wife and a mother figure, but not under such dire conditions. Amid the clamor, a rumor circulated: an old prospector named Jeb Dawson, who lived on the higher slopes above Greenwood, hadn't been seen since the storms began. Some claimed they heard him shouting for help 2 nights ago. Others insisted he was away on a prospecting trip. The uncertainty weighed heavily, for if the storms continued, more slides could strike the slopes. Several volunteers proposed forming a search party to check on him. That afternoon, Zachary approached Charlotte with a hesitant request. "I need to ride up to Jeb Dawson's shack. Folks say he might be trapped, but I can't leave Patrick and Graham alone. Would you watch them?" His eyes flickered with an apology. "I wish I could let you rest." Charlotte nodded without hesitation. "Of course. Go help Mr. Dawson. I'll look after the boys." Beneath her calm composure, a swirl of emotions brewed. She had come to Greenwood to be his partner in marriage, yet they were still near strangers, bound by crisis more than affection. Perhaps in time, the latter would grow. For now, she accepted her role, determined to make a difference. Zachary and a handful of men set out, leading pack horses loaded with supplies and rope. The trek up the muddy trails would be treacherous, but they couldn't bear the thought of leaving Jeb Dawson to a grim fate. As Charlotte tended to the boys, persuading them to nap in a corner of the blacksmith shop, she noticed the slump-shouldered figure of Harlan Briggs stepping gingerly through the mess. Harlan wasn't known for social visits, so his arrival drew her attention. "Hello, Mr. Briggs," she greeted politely, forcing a friendly tone. He tipped his stained hat. "Miss Addison, word is, you're the new bride in town. Awful sorry your introduction to Greenwood has been so rough." She offered a thin smile. "We have to make do with what we have." He nodded, glancing at the sleeping boys. "That we do. Listen, I know Zachary's taken a posse up the mountain, but you should know there's talk that more storms are heading our way. If Jeb Dawson's place is in trouble, them men might need help from someone who knows the land." Charlotte's brow furrowed. "Do you mean the local sheriff?" Harlan exhaled a short, humorless laugh. Sheriff Parker's holed up in the next county, dealing with a bank robbery. No, I meant Daniel McGraw. Heard of him? Former Texas Ranger. Lives on a small ranch just beyond the ridge. He's none too sociable, but he's a good man to have in a crisis. The mention of a former Texas Ranger sparked curiosity in Charlotte's mind. She had heard stories of these lawmen, brave, sometimes ruthless men who kept order in the wild frontier. "Do you think he can help?" she asked. Harlan shrugged. "If we can convince him. Folks say he prefers to keep to himself, ever since, well, you'll hear the gossip eventually. Something about losing his family to outlaws, or so the rumors go." He glanced at the door. "I'll ride out and see if he'll come lend a hand. Because if another mudslide hits while we're this vulnerable, we'll need all the help we can get." With that, Harlan trudged off. Charlotte stared after him, hugging her elbows. The land still felt unsettled, as though the storms had only paused, gathering energy for another onslaught. She prayed Zachary and the others would return safely, that Jeb Dawson was alive, and that Greenwood wouldn't suffer another blow. In the back of her mind, though, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real test hadn't yet come. And so, in the hush of an overcast afternoon, Charlotte Addison hovered between hope and dread, kneading bread dough in a battered bowl. She didn't know that soon enough, a mysterious figure named Daniel McGraw would stride into town, bearing scars deeper than bullet wounds. Nor did she suspect that his presence would weave a new thread of fate into her own. For now, all she could do was keep her shoulders straight, guard the children, and wait. It was late evening when Zachary and his search party returned, worn and spattered with mud. They carried solemn news. Jeb Dawson's shack had been torn from its foundation by a massive mudslide. Of Jeb himself, there was no trace. They found only his old walking cane near a collapsed ravine. Some of the men stayed behind to search further at first light, but the outlook was grim. Charlotte's heart sank. Despite having never met Jeb Dawson, she grieved for a soul lost in the storm's merciless wake. The boys asked if Mr. Dawson would be okay, and Charlotte could only muster a comforting lie, "We don't know yet, dears." The truth weighed heavy. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly. The mood around town was subdued, with each person grappling with their own losses. While coaxing a meager fire to life, Charlotte spied a lone rider approaching on the horizon. The figure wore a tattered duster and had the wide-brimmed hat typical of frontier men, but something in his posture suggested he was as watchful as a hawk. He dismounted at the edge of Greenwood, scanning the muddy remnants of buildings with grim eyes. Rebecca Lowry stepped forward to greet him. Although Charlotte couldn't hear their conversation, she saw Rebecca gesture toward Zachary's workshop. The stranger nodded, patted his horse, and made his way through the wreckage-strewn street. Curiosity drew Charlotte outside, a damp shawl around her shoulders. As the stranger neared, she noticed scars on his face, faint lines crossing his cheek and jaw, telling stories of violence or misfortune. Dark hair showed at the edges of his hat, streaked with silver at the temples, and he carried himself with a measured calm that belied danger. His eyes flicked to Charlotte, then settled on Zachary, who was hammering a twisted horseshoe back into shape. "Zachary Turner?" the man asked, in a low, even voice. Zachary glanced up, wiping his brow. "Yes, sir." The stranger removed his hat out of courtesy, if not warmth. "Name's Daniel McGraw. Harlan Briggs said you could use assistance." Zachary studied him briefly, then nodded. "We can use all the help we can get. There's a slope above town that's threatening another slide, especially if the rain starts up again. We're short-handed. If you're able..." Daniel's jaw set in a firm line. "That's what I came for." His gaze flicked to Charlotte. "Ma'am." She introduced herself quietly. "Charlotte Addison." Daniel offered a polite inclination of his head. A pleasure, though I reckon you're not finding Greenwood particularly welcoming at the moment. Charlotte forced a small smile. No one is to blame for the storm. A shadow crossed Daniel's features, but he said nothing. Zachary cleared his throat, stepping in. We'll be working on reinforcing that slope. We're looking at digging a new drainage trench. If we can redirect the flow of water, it might spare the rest of the town. Daniel nodded curtly. Show me where. Thus began a day of backbreaking labor. Daniel McGraw proved skilled in leading men, his Texas Ranger background evident in the calm authority he wielded. While not loquacious, he gave clear instructions on how to fortify the hill's base with timber supports. He organized the men into shifts, ensuring no one overexerted themselves to the point of collapse. His sharp eyes surveyed every boulder and crevice as though scanning for weaknesses. Charlotte brought food and water to the workers. Her hands blistered from chopping vegetables and hauling buckets, but her spirit undaunted. She studied Daniel whenever he paused to rest. There was a gravity about him, like a man bearing old wounds. She overheard fragments of conversation. Some men mentioned his reputation. He once tracked a gang of rustlers across 3 counties. He's lethal with a Colt. He left the Rangers after a personal tragedy. The specifics were muddled by rumor, but the fear and respect were clear. At midday, while the men took a brief break beneath a scraggly oak tree, Charlotte approached with a bowl of stew. Mr. McGraw, she said softly, please have some. He glanced up, taking the bowl without fuss. Thank you, Mom. She settled on a rock near him, wiping sweat from her brow. I wanted to thank you for helping this town. We're strangers to you. Daniel sipped the stew, then shrugged. The frontiers taught me that sometimes stepping in is the only decent thing to do. My place isn't far from here. If Greenwood floods or washes away, it affects us all. Her curiosity piqued. Charlotte ventured, if it's not too forward. I've heard you were a Texas Ranger once. That must have been a challenging life. His jaw tightened. It had its moments. Not wishing to pry, she simply nodded. Well, thank you, truly. Daniel finished the stew, offered a polite nod, and stood to resume work. Charlotte watched him go, sensing there was a deeper story behind his guarded demeanor, lost pain, or perhaps betrayal. Yet that day, he worked tirelessly alongside Zachary and others, chipping away at the hillside to carve out a new drainage path. If there was one thing Greenwood needed now, beyond food supplies and strong backs, it was a guiding hand to keep them all from losing hope. By sundown, progress had been made. The new trench, though rudimentary, might divert waters from the precarious slope. Daniel scouted the area once more, satisfied with the day's effort, but not wholly confident the worst had passed. We'll see if the next storm tests our work, he said quietly, wiping dirt from his calloused hands. Zachary shook Daniel's hand. You saved us a lot of time. If we'd tried this on our own, it might have taken days. Daniel offered a barely perceptible nod, then turned to go. Charlotte couldn't help but call after him, Will you come by tomorrow? We could use more help. He paused, the brim of his hat shading his face. We'll see. And with that, he mounted his horse and rode off, disappearing over the ridge. A strange hush settled after his departure, as though he carried with him some intangible force that left the air charged in his wake. For Charlotte, the day ended with exhaustion, but also a dawning realization that Greenwood's future might hinge on alliances with men like Daniel McGraw. Storms could be weathered, but only if people came together trusting one another's strengths. Yet trust could be a slippery concept on the frontier, especially among those harboring old scars. As night enveloped Greenwood again, the question weighed on her mind. Would Daniel's arrival be a blessing or herald greater turmoil in an already battered town? In the days that followed, Greenwood Valley teetered between recovery and relapse. Thick grey clouds skulked overhead, hinting at further rainfall. The newly dug drainage trench held diverting small rivulets away from the threatened slope, but everyone knew one more torrential downpour could undo their work. Houses still sagged, stables were half collapsed, and new mud seemed to appear out of nowhere each morning. Charlotte Addison found herself strangely content despite the hardships. Perhaps it was the sense of purpose, caring for Patrick and Graham, cooking for the men, laboring on repairs, and tending to small injuries. Zachary, grateful for her unwavering support, tried to propose an official ceremony to finalize their marriage, but circumstances forced them to postpone. "It seems wrong to celebrate when half the town is still in rubble," he admitted, looking defeated. Charlotte agreed, albeit with a twinge of disappointment. She'd wanted to seal their union properly, to remove any remaining sense of being an outsider. On the third day, Daniel McGraw returned to Greenwood, quietly checking on the trench's integrity and offering suggestions for reinforcing the hillside. Though still taciturn, he stopped to exchange a few words with Charlotte. Patrick and Graham eyed him warily at first. His imposing presence and glinting revolver unnerved them, but Daniel surprised them by fashioning small wooden figures out of broken fence posts, handing them to the boys without fanfare. The children accepted the toys with wide-eyed gratitude. Seeing a gentle act from so stoic a man stirred something tender in Charlotte's heart. Zachary, too, noticed Daniel's growing rapport with the townspeople and the subtle signs that Charlotte found Daniel intriguing. A prickle of jealousy lanced through him. After all, Charlotte was his intended bride. Yet the blacksmith couldn't deny how valuable Daniel's expertise was. Under the ranger's guidance, they discovered an overlooked slope that needed shoring up. Daniel also proved a steady hand whenever outlaws or rustlers lurked in the region. News of cattle thefts reached Greenwood, making folks uneasy. At the saloon, rumors buzzed that a gang might be looking to exploit the town's vulnerability. One afternoon, Zachary invited Daniel to share a quick meal in the workshop. The two men crouched on overturned barrels, devouring beef stew and cornbread Charlotte had made. Patrick and Graham played nearby, chasing each other through puddles. Zachary cleared his throat. "Daniel, I'm grateful for everything you've done. If not for you, we might have lost more of the town." Daniel shrugged. Folks do what they must to survive. Zachary's gaze flicked toward Charlotte, who was outside gathering kindling. "She's a rare woman, isn't she?" He wasn't entirely sure why he said it. Perhaps to claim ownership of her in the conversation or to gauge Daniel's reaction. Daniel's face remained impassive. She is that he allowed. Courageous too. Not many would stay after what's happened. "She's my fiancée," Zachary continued a bit more pointedly. "We plan to wed soon, once the town is stable again." Daniel nodded slowly, meeting Zachary's eyes. "I wish you both well." There was no malice in his voice, but Zachary couldn't shake the sense that Daniel was holding back some private thought. After a moment, the blacksmith spoke again. "We could still use help around here. Some folks say you're the best shot in these parts. With the law so far away and rumors of raiders creeping in, maybe we can form a local watch, keep Greenwood safe. If you're willing." Daniel stared at his empty bowl, wrestling with an inner conflict. "I left the ranger life for a reason," he said quietly. "But I'll not stand by if outlaws threaten innocent people." Zachary nodded, relieved. "Then we can figure something out together." Unbeknownst to them, Charlotte had been listening from the threshold. She felt a pangs of sympathy for Daniel. His eyes, cold and vigilant, hinted at a buried sorrow She instinctively wanted to soothe, but she reminded herself, "My role here is to be Zachary's helpmeet. We are promised to each other." Yet that night, as she lay awake on a makeshift cot, exhausted from her duties, her mind drifted to Daniel, his quiet strength, the subtle kindness he showed the children, and the haunted look he occasionally bore. What heartbreak lay behind those eyes? She scolded herself for dwelling on another man. She was grateful to Zachary for bringing her here, for trusting her with his nephews, for striving against all odds to rebuild. But even so, she sensed a restlessness stirring in her own heart, an unspoken question of destiny and love. Meanwhile, across Greenwood Valley, the rains returned, a light drizzle pattering on rooftops. Some folks huddled around candles, whispering prayers that the newly fortified slope would hold. Others kept watch for suspicious riders that might attempt a nighttime raid. And on a small ranch beyond the ridge, Daniel McGraw stared into a dying hearth. Memories, swirling memories of a family lost to bandits, a life once dedicated to the badge, and a longing for peace he could never quite find. Fate had led him to Greenwood. Now it seemed set on tangling his path with that of Charlotte Addison, and perhaps rewriting both their stories in ways neither had anticipated. Tensions rose in Greenwood Valley when word spread that a gang known as the Ortiz brothers had been spotted nearby. They specialized in striking vulnerable settlements, stealing supplies, and disappearing into the desert. With the local sheriff still tied up in a neighboring county, the town looked to Daniel McGraw almost by default for leadership and protection. Daniel was reluctant to assume the role of lawman again. Yet as Zachary and the other townsmen pressed him, he recognized the necessity. A plan was formed, a night watch. They would rotate small patrols armed with rifles or shotguns. Daniel insisted on using vantage points on the surrounding hills, ensuring they could see anyone approaching well before an ambush. Charlotte joined the other women in quietly preparing for the worst, stockpiling water, stashing valuables in hidden spots, and keeping children indoors after sundown. She helped sharpen knives, patch torn clothing, and calm rattled nerves. Even as the men set up watchposts, the persistent drizzle slicked the ground. Everyone braced for a standoff with both nature and outlaws. On the second night of vigilance, a half-moon glimmered through ragged clouds. The muddy tracks around Greenwood glistened faintly. Charlotte was in the blacksmith shop with Patrick and Graham trying to coax them into sleep. Zachary paced outside, rifle slung over his shoulder. Daniel stood guard at a hilltop vantage, scanning the perimeter through a spyglass. An uneasy hush settled until the bark of a dog shattered the silence. From the hilltop, Daniel spotted dim shapes moving in the distance. Within moments, he rode down to alert the others. Riders coming from the south, he said, breath ragged. Could be them. We have to be ready. Zachary rallied the men, positioning them along the main street. Daniel took up a hidden spot behind the ruins of the livery stable. Tension crackled in the cool night air. Charlotte huddled inside the workshop, arms wrapped around the children, listening to each rattling breath. She was no stranger to fear. She'd faced it with each thunderstorm and mudslide, but this felt different, a tangible human threat, cunning and malicious. Within half an hour, 7 dark figures on horseback emerged from the shadows at the town's edge. One of the riders, presumably an Ortiz brother, called out in Spanish-accented English, "We don't want trouble, amigos. Just bring us your supplies, and we'll be on our way." No one responded immediately. Zachary posted behind an overturned wagon, clenched his rifle. Daniel observed the riders from his vantage point, counting them, noting their weapons. Charlotte, peeking through a gap in the boarded window, could see the reflection of moonlight on steel. Her heart thudded. A second voice barked, "We saw your lights. You can't hide." Then came a shot, an echoing crack that split the night. One of the gang members had fired into the air, presumably to intimidate. Fear rippled through the townsfolk, but no one panicked. Daniel had been clear wait for the outlaws to dismount or reveal themselves more clearly before returning fire. The tension snapped when a bullet ricocheted off a metal gate dangerously close to where Zachary crouched. He fired back, prompting a staccato exchange of gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit the street, the acrid smell of gunpowder mingling with damp earth. Horses whinnied, some rearing in alarm. Shouts in Spanish and English filled the air. Daniel took careful aim from behind the stable's broken wall. In a swift movement, he squeezed the trigger, felling a rider who had been edging toward the workshop. Another outlaw tumbled from his horse under the hail of bullets from the townsmen. The gang, evidently not expecting such organized resistance, panicked. Two riders wheeled around, retreating into the darkness. One fell to the ground, wounded, before he could escape. Within minutes, the assault ended. The Ortiz brothers, if indeed it was them, had underestimated Greenwood's resolve. Daniel and Zachary, hearts pounding, advanced cautiously. A wounded bandit lay groaning in the mud, clutching a leg wound. The rest had fled or been neutralized. Rebecca Lowry appeared with a lantern, illuminating the scene of disarray, spent shells, smoldering wagon debris, and the acrid stench of fear. In the aftermath, Charlotte rushed out, face ashen. She spotted Zachary alive and unhurt, exhaling a shaky breath. Then she scanned for Daniel. He emerged from the darkness, unharmed but grim. Their eyes met, and in that flicker of relief, Charlotte felt a surge of gratitude for both men who had defended the town that was now her home. The battered bandit was taken to the mercantile, where a corner was cleared for him. As he moaned in pain, Daniel knelt to examine the wound. "Stay still," he ordered, voice cold. "We'll see to your leg." The man glared, but offered no more resistance, perhaps resigned to his fate. At dawn, a ragged sense of victory tinged the atmosphere. Greenwood had stood firm against a threat that might have reduced them to ruin. But tensions within the town simmered. The men who once eyed Daniel with suspicion now regarded him as a hero. Zachary, though grateful, sensed that Charlotte's admiration for Daniel had only grown deeper, and Charlotte herself struggled with conflicting emotions. Gratitude for Zachary's steadfastness, fascination with Daniel's quiet bravery, and an aching sense of guilt for feeling torn. No one had time to dwell on uncertain affections, however. The battered town still needed rebuilding. The slope still loomed overhead, and more storms threatened. For now, Greenwood Valley had secured a reprieve from bandits, but the future remained precarious. And in the hush after the gunfire, Charlotte suspected that the greatest battle might yet be fought in her own heart. News of Greenwood's defense spread swiftly. Esteban, the wounded bandit, lay guarded in the back of the mercantile, grudgingly mumbling, "Gracias," as Charlotte changed his bandages. Though unrepentant, he seemed bewildered by her gentleness. With the rest of the gang gone, a fragile calm settled. The town rallied to rebuild. The blacksmith shop reopened in limited capacity, the saloon's roof patched, and a garden was planted where the earth had held firm. Children dared to play again, laughter returning in cautious bursts. One afternoon, Charlotte approached Daniel McGraw as he inspected the drainage trench. "How does it look?" she asked. "For now it holds," he replied, eyes narrowed on the slope. but the ground's still soft. One bad storm could undo it. She nodded. "Thank you for everything. You saved that man's life," he said. "Most wouldn't bother." Charlotte lowered her eyes. "Every life matters, even the broken ones." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then murmured, "This land can beat that out of people. But you've held on." She hesitated, then asked, "Is it true what they say about your family?" His jaw tightened. "My wife and daughter, gone. I was out chasing outlaws, came back too late. I'm so sorry," she whispered, her heart aching. He stared at the ridge as though haunted. "I swore I'd never chase shadows again. But I can't stand by when people need help." She touched his arm, then quickly withdrew. Their eyes met briefly, but it was enough. He stepped back. "You should get that laundry in before it rains." That night, Charlotte lay awake, staring out the window. She cared for Zachary and the boys, who now called her Ma. But something had shifted. The storm had passed, but the winds in her heart had only just begun to stir. Morning sun broke through the dissipating clouds, casting a hopeful glow over Greenwood Valley. The mud had dried to a firm crust, rooftops gleamed under fresh repairs, and laughter returned to the streets. Even Esteban, the injured bandit, lay quietly recovering under watch in the mercantile. Zachary Turner, seizing the calm, invited the townspeople to gather at the undamaged church. With a steady voice and eyes full of intent, he addressed them all. "We've been through storms and bloodshed, but we're still here. It's time to celebrate what we still have." He turned to Charlotte, standing near the altar. "I'd like to marry this woman if she'll have me." Charlotte, heart pounding, stepped forward. She admired Zachary's devotion, the boy's affection, and the steadiness he brought. She nodded. The pastor, recently returned from a mission trip, officiated the modest ceremony. Charlotte and Zachary exchanged vows of mutual support and survival. When the kiss came, it was warm, gentle, more grateful than passionate. The townsfolk erupted into applause, throwing bits of scrap paper like confetti. Even Daniel McGraw stood in the shadows, watching with unreadable eyes. Afterward, they celebrated outside, with bread stew and music. Children danced barefoot in the dust. Charlotte greeted neighbors, accepted congratulations, and cradled Patrick and Graham in each arm. But her gaze often wandered. Eventually, she spotted Daniel near the edge of the gathering. She approached him quietly. "Thank you for coming, it means a great deal." Daniel gave a polite nod. "You deserve happiness, Charlotte. You and Zachary." There was a pause. She searched his face for any hint of regret. "Will you stay a while?" He shook his head gently. "You know where to find me if the town needs help." Then he turned and mounted his horse, disappearing over the ridge without another word. Back at Zachary's side, Charlotte accepted his hand. This was her life now, the path she had chosen. She told herself it was right, that time would deepen her love for him as surely as it already had for his nephews. Weeks passed. Greenwood healed. The blacksmith shop rang with hammer and steel. Charlotte made a home out of the refurbished space. The boys studied by lamplight while she cooked meals and stitched together scraps of fabric into usable clothes. But at dusk, when the light painted the desert in gold, Charlotte sometimes stood alone at the window, eyes drifting toward the horizon. She told herself she was looking for clouds, but in her heart, she knew she was searching for a lone rider. Still, she stayed. She honored her vow. And Greenwood, though, scarred by storm and loss, endured. In the aftermath of perilous storms, ruthless outlaws, and the demanding crucible of frontier life, Greenwood Valley found the slimmest thread of hope and clung to it. Charlotte Addison Turner stood beside Zachary, fulfilling her role as wife caretaker and stalwart companion. Daniel McGraw, haunted by ghosts of his past, remained Greenwood's silent guardian, ready to protect the vulnerable at a moment's notice. Though hearts carried unspoken yearnings and shared regrets, the enduring spirit of a town battered by nature and cruelty prevailed. The West, after all, was built on grit's second chances and the raw will to survive. Thank you for joining us on this dramatic Western journey. If you enjoyed the story of Greenwood Valley, the trials of Charlotte, and Daniel McGraw's quiet heroism, please like this video, share it with friends who love frontier tales, and subscribe to our channel for more riveting stories. Until next time, keep that pioneering spirit alive, partner.